really delighted to welcome Iggy Rhodes from the EEF, who's going to be talking to us about improving behaviour in schools, the EEF's guidance report. And just as a quick introduction to Iggy, she's also the EEF's regional rep for London and the South East. And I wondered, Iggy, if just before we really start looking at a few points in that report, if you could just tell us what sort of experiences have you been having over the last few weeks and months when things have been so strange in our school system?
Yeah, they have been strange. So as my role mostly involves supporting research schools to train teachers, there's a lot of that role certainly has been on hold or has involved a lot of adjustment. And the EEF central team has been creating new streams of work to support what's going on now and what's going to be going on as we have more children back in schools. I won't say return to normal. I know that's kind of a bit of a moot point. So I've been part of a rapid evidence review on online learning for pupils, and I'm leading a project to get a rapid evidence review done on online CPD for teachers as well, so that we can understand a bit about what the evidence can tell us as we're redesigning things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people really appreciated that rapid evidence review of online learning. Came in just at the right time for people who were really wondering if it was just them that had some of those questions about what sort of approaches were looking effective. So it felt like really important stuff. So we've been talking together about improving behaviour in schools, and it kind of both feels really important at the moment, but also just slightly strange to be thinking through some of this material during this time when we've had such a small number of children in our schools, but are in that critical moment now of preparing for more children and managing the needs of more children as they come back. And it really struck me, looking at the report, that first recommendation just feels so important at the moment. Know and understand your pupils and their influences. And I wondered if you could just talk us through a little bit about what lay behind that first recommendation.
Yeah, of course. So that is not the first recommendation by accident. The experts involved in putting this together and who wrote the review and who were on the panel all agreed that it was quite a primary thing. You know, it's the first thing you do. It's really important for establishing good behaviour. So yeah, it was there as part of lots of bits of evidence, and I think a lot of the evidence comes from kind of a public health background, and actually understanding what's behind behaviour is really important, because if just understanding how someone's behaving doesn't mean that you know how to respond to it. If the different reasons might mean that a response is going to be more and more effective.
Yeah, and that's going to mean we're going to have to position ourselves to be really open and to learn a lot about the children and young people coming back into our schools, because we may have known them really well a few months ago, but they may have quite different experiences behind them now, and we'll have to kind of get to know them afresh. And I think we know that during this period, we are going to have some disruption in our classrooms. We are going to find it difficult to always put pupils with someone who knows them really well. How do you think we should be thinking this challenge through?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important priority for school leaders, is ensuring that pupils are supported by someone who can get to know them well. So for adults who are establishing new relationships because they can't be in their usual class setting for all various reasons there are, I guess leaders can emphasize for those adults who they're putting into new classes and new situations, that the relationship building is one of the first and most important things they can be doing. And there are all sorts of different ways that they might do that will be school specific, but I think for staff, understanding that establishing that relationship is important. It will be really helpful as a steer. And actually this, the concept of having a bubble, I think might help with this. So a smaller group, a consistent group is more likely to be able to establish those bonds, both between, an adult and a child, and between the different children if they're different groups from before. And there may be, obviously there will be some key staff in schools shielding for the next little while at least, and for leaders prioritising how those staff might be able to retain a connection with their students. It will be important. It might be that, it depends on all sorts of different things about the policies of the school, safeguarding, but, whether it's pre-recording a video that's for the class they know well, or it's establishing a safe way of there being phone calls between a teacher and their families. Those things could be really important to bring those children through.
Yeah, so in a way, allowing people to feel confident to give time to relationship building. We're all going to have an awful lot on our mind, but it feels like what you're saying is really do give time for relationship building.
Yeah, exactly. And there are other ways that we understand pupils. It might be that there are surveys, or phone calls might be happening with families at the moment that help to understand context, but understanding their how they're doing in terms of education at the moment, which you might do through all the different ways that teachers assess learning, or there are lots of different ways that you might understand the whole group of pupils, but those individual relationships, certainly really, really important at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So before we got together online today, I was rereading the report, and something that really jumped out of the report for me in a powerful but also quite painful way was the section that talks about children and young people who've had difficult experiences, very difficult experiences in their lives. And the example you give in the report is bereavement, the loss of a close relative. And that really did feel very powerful now, and made me think of children and young people who might feel quite lost and quite angry. And these might lead to situations that are very difficult to handle in our schools. And you also talk about the need for targeted approaches to children and young people who have that level of difficulty. And I wondered if you could just help us. How should we be approaching that question of targeted approaches with reference to those children and young people who've had the most difficult experiences?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. There are some very, very difficult experiences being had at the moment. I think, a positive is, unfortunately, really, really sadly, the expertise for each individual, incredibly traumatic event that is happening now does exist already, because, there are families who've experienced bereavement for other reasons, or isolation for other reasons. And so I think for school leaders, the priority will be establishing really what the key issues are for their pupils, the issues that are biggest for individual pupils, and also the issues that are most prevalent among their pupils, and where appropriate, then establishing a connection with the right kind of expert. So it might be that, we know that the death rates are, for example, are very different in different communities, and so it'll look very different from one school to another. It might be that a counsellor who specialises in grief, it just is a really, really important priority for one school, and then they prioritise their time and funding that way. But another school, it might not be that. It might be socialisation, because the children have been at home and have been very isolated. So I guess it's back to understanding, starting to work out what's going on for those kids, and then talking to the appropriate people. Those, I think, in a lot of cases, those will be people that the school has existing connections with, which is helpful. But if not, I think, looking out slightly to other local schools and sharing resources, and and connections. There are obviously other bodies that can really help with sourcing expertise as well. I know the NSPCC, for example, have a lot about safeguarding.
And I think we're all aware that some children and young people have been quite busy and industrious at home and done a lot of online learning, and others have not been able to engage for a whole variety of reasons, many of them very good reasons. And the report again talks about those children and young people who get disengaged from learning, and that then difficult behaviour kind of fills the void, the space that would otherwise be taken up by their interest in schoolwork. And I wondered if that might be something we should particularly prepare ourselves for.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in the report, a lot more of it is about proactive strategies than about reacting. And we can predict pretty confidently that there will be a need to reset expectations. That I think actually gives us a way of preparing. There's a lot at the moment that we can't prepare for. How many pupils are going to be in the school next week, for example, but understanding that there will need to be a reset of routines and a reset of expectations, I think, is a big one. And for school leaders, that's about a real emphasis on culture. There will be, you know, pupils who are adjusting, but also there'll be lots of new things. So the school culture is going to have to, you know, be reset and expanded to include some kind of new routines.
I think that, you know, when you see improving behaviour in schools, you know, you've kind of will give you a picture that there is this kind of persistent problem in our schools. And yet one of the eye-catching things in that report is that behaviour generally is good in schools. And that also that hasn't, according to surveys of teachers' views, that hasn't really changed much in recent years. Teachers' views have been remarkably stable. But what teachers do seem to be saying through surveys is that what they do find difficult is around inconsistent responses from one class to another. That seems to be the thing that really does undermine people's professional confidence around this issue. And I wondered again if you could just talk us through a little bit about that issue of consistency.
I'd say consistency seems to be very important. It's certainly something that teachers feel strongly about, and it's something that the evidence would kind of suggest it will be really important. But we could do with more evidence. This is definitely something, I would say, an area that we could do with bigger studies, but studying whole school consistency of implementation of complex change is quite tricky, and I think that's why, you know, there isn't quite as much evidence.
Okay, I also picked out the fact that whereas it's probably tempting to imagine that one approach or a strategy is really going to be the key to unlocking the difficulty in a school, I think what you actually say feels more like it's the skillful blending of a range of different approaches and strategies which is proven to be most effective in schools. And I wondered if you could just tell us again a little bit more about this combining different strategies, which seems so important.
Yeah, of course. Well, the academic team from Exeter University who conducted the evidence review said they'd be interested in, rather than just looking at interventions, seeing what the different elements of those interventions seem to be that led to something effective when they were combined. So they found two totally different strands, which was quite interesting. They found that there were, I'd say that it's an intense or a light approach, and they really do kind of have kind of separate things in them. So one way of effectively improving behaviour that several different programs kind of enacted was to ensure that there's a tailoring to individuals, so that kind of targeting of individuals who've got different behaviour needs, often for a range of different reasons. So ensure there's some really specific support for them. And have teacher training in classroom management. Now, classroom management training is intensive. It's at least 20 hours of training over the course of several weeks, possibly a couple of terms.
Mm.
And focusing on relationships between teachers and pupils, and between pupils. So that's 3 different things, really intensive. If you combine all 3 of those, you lead to really effective behaviour outcomes, or a lot of interventions have done in the past.
Okay.
But completely separate strand is to, when trying to address behaviour, focusing on academic issues. So sometimes academic issues, especially low literacy, which can affect you in every new subject, can lead to behaviour issues if you're not accessing the curriculum. So addressing those and putting the emphasis on pupils' own behaviours. So explicitly teaching learning behaviours, teaching pupils about self-regulation, controlling their own behaviour, working well with others. That can be another effective route. So really the emphasis is back on leaders there. What does your school look like in terms of behaviour, and how do you know? So not just looking at what behaviours are we seeing, but what's sitting behind those behaviours, what's going on for the pupil that's misbehaving, and actually that should inform which route might seem most appropriate, because that first one is really time intensive, and it will make a massive difference if it is deployed in the right schools, ones with more ingrained behaviour problems, maybe behaviour problems in quite a few classrooms. But the second route might actually be as effective or more effective in a school in a different circumstance, and it'll be much less time intensive.
Okay. And again, that kind of touches on 2 themes which we often see in guidance from the Education Endowment Foundation. The first one is that light touch, kind of one-off professional development events are really unlikely to be very impactful. And it's really striking the way you talk there about 20 hours of professional development being what will have a really big effect on improving behaviour in a school where behaviour is an issue. And the second thing I think we often see in these guidance reports is that it's so important for leaders to spend enough time to understand their situation before choosing any particular strategy. So like you say, in some contexts, a focus on literacy in the curriculum might be far the best way to address problems around low-level disruption and behaviour in the school. But you have to really have spent time understanding your context before making those decisions as a leader.
Yeah, you really do. And, for some, particularly for, early career teachers, more regularly for early career teachers, that classroom management approach is going to be effective and it's worth the investment. But as a leader looking at a school level, you might say, actually, one teacher would really benefit from this intensive programme, but for everyone else, this is going to be the focus. It's selecting what you use really carefully based on understanding of your own context. It's not just the behaviour report, is it? It's all of the it's excellent leadership, really.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if there's anything in the report that feels particularly relevant and pertinent to you in the Newham context now.
It's an incredibly challenging time, I think, particularly in areas like Newham that are so hard hit. It is much more difficult for some families than for others. I think, stepping back, the role that evidence plays in the system generally is to combine with experience to support decision making for school leaders and others. And at the moment, we're in a time that we've never experienced before. So we can't rely quite all just on our experience. The evidence, therefore, can be important to bring in. And I think what we need to be careful of is that we're engaging properly with the kind of principles of evidence rather than buying products off the shelf, because the products off the shelf, we might know they've worked somewhere else, but if we're thinking about the principles of what should work first, this is the right time really to be doing that. I think one of the things that's really emphasised in the report, and it just came out in so much of the literature, was about a positive approach to behaviour. And you know, a lot of the families in Newham, you know, many in quite cramped accommodation, it's going to be hard for them to have had many positive experiences at home. And I think for school leaders who are welcoming children back in, they're managing their stressed staff body, who will be hearing new stories that they hadn't heard of, you know, during the period most children were out, and becoming more stressed about those. They're also dealing with lots of new practical logistical issues, and it can be quite easy when you've got new logistical issues to deal with to focus on those. You know, you have to be there on the line, and actually I think as a leader, a constant reinforcing of the message that we're looking for opportunities to praise pupils for remembering the old routines, which we're explicitly going back over, and also engaging well with new routines that are maybe temporary and to do with social distancing. I think that setting, you know, modelling and reminding really regularly staff of that will be really important. Behaviour, you know, it's habitual, it's ingrained, and that's true for teachers as much as anyone else. And so taking the time with staff to reinforce these new behaviours with them and remind them of the importance of that positive behaviour management, I think there's been no kind of more important time for them to be doing that.